I was an intern at the Barbican in film marketing, and went across and did some freelance programming with them and some bits of consultation. And I got an email from someone asking about whether I would want to cover a film that was playing at the Barbican, and I said yes, and that was for Cineview. And then from there it sort of grew. I found that I was enjoying that a lot more than marketing, unsurprisingly. And from that, sort of, it just grew, pitched out to more people, started taking on a more role, bigger role, and then also just sort of learning the mechanisms of how it all works, which is, when you start out, you've no idea that all these screenings take place and go on, and who do you contact, and where do you email, and why are there 16 different companies you have to go through, and things like that. And that sort of, I guess I found sort of, I'd always had a deep passion for film, as well as literature, and so it was a kind of thing where I just found something I really wanted to do, I guess, and it felt that it fitted. It's that cliche of sort of you do the job that makes you happy.
May I ask, do you make a living from it, or do you have a day job?
I make a living from it. I'm salaried, not for film criticism, but for film journalism. So that's junketing and feature interviews and things like that. So yeah, I do, and then I freelance as well on the side. So it's sort of, I'm quite a privileged position, I think, because not everyone who does this does get to have it as their day job as well. Obviously, there are aspects of it that sort of you don't realise you're going to take on when you have a salary. Lots of admin, far too much admin, but yeah, I do.
All right, this is quite a big question, but yeah. What is film criticism? What's its point? What's its value? Does it have those?
I believe it does have value. For me, film criticism and film journalism is about conversation, and that sort of the role of a film journalist or a film critic is to, with their knowledge, express what's understood within the film critic community. So listening to other voices and sort of, almost what the status quo is, and reflect on that whilst giving their own personal take on it. There is a big thing of, you don't use I in film reviews, and I'm very pro that, but the idea that it is objective is nonsensical to me, that it's purely subjective, because it has to be, because it's so deeply personal. It's about your relationship with what's going on the screen. But you have to tether that with what's going on within the film industry, actually. Is whilst it's art, it's also business, and sort of appreciating and understanding that, so why the stories have been formulated the way they are. And on top of that, the important thing is to communicate that to the general public, that it should be a thing that the job, I suppose, is to be a link between what the director wanted to create. This isn't auteur theory, but the story that's being tried to be told by everyone involved in the film, interpreting that, how successful that has been, and how that relates to the general public, and whether they should. Ultimately, I suppose there's the commercial value of, should they spend £15 on a cinema ticket in London to, go and see this, or are they wasting their time? But it's also about digging deeper into the film. There's nothing wrong with the word entertainment. Films are entertainment, but it's also sort of peeling back the layers a bit more and trying to see what it's actually saying. So, if it's politically relevant, if it's socially relevant, adding that layer of commentary with informed knowledge. I think this is a really important thing. Sort of, film criticism has been democratised, but if it doesn't come with a specialised knowledge, you're just spouting your opinions, ill-informed perhaps.
You said that film writing is subjective in a sense because there's an individual behind the writing. It always is going to be subjective. But do you think that there is any element of film criticism that is objective, or could be termed objective? any aspect. I mean, evaluation is going to be subjective. You know, your decision as to whether a film is good or bad, some people might argue that can be an objective decision, but I think in an obvious way it isn't.
Yeah.
So let's leave evaluation aside for a bit. Is there anything else that critics do that you think might be less subjective and more dependent on a base of knowledge?
Yeah, their wealth of knowledge. I'm not sure I do, actually. Their wealth of knowledge and the wealth of knowledge that should come with the job, and I'd say the responsibility of the job as well, is that there is a level of objectivity in how they pull their knowledge together, but even that would be a subjective choice in terms of how, if you're going to reference films from your previous knowledge, how you order and categorize everything in your own head is a subjective choice, and will be based upon your emotional connection and aesthetic relationship to it, your tastes, your background. I mean, I think this is something that's also important, is that how we are as individuals does inform how we interpret movies, and sort of, I think there's an ethical level to that as well.
Okay, and would you say there's a difference between being a film critic and a film reviewer? Are they different? Do they overlap? What is the difference? And which do you identify?
Probably reviewer, although that might be sort of a level of insecurity on my part, in that to be called a critic is often things like belonging to the critic circles, or to impose the title upon yourself perhaps is something. A critic just means, I suppose, coming with a critical mind to a topic. That is what a critic is.
Is that not what you do?
It is what I do, but if they are viewed, I think it's also sort of how the film community of journalists operates, and sort of, I'd say there's a hierarchy that I wouldn't necessarily agree with that exists, based on almost levels of importance, perhaps. Sort of, it's deemed, if you write for a paper, your opinion may be more valid than if you write for an online blog. I don't believe that at all. But I would say there is a general attitude that is what's in existence. Sort of, there isn't. So it's about authority, I suppose. That's what all criticism can be backed by, which is, the ultimate question comes down is, who am I to say this about this film? It's truth. Sort of, films will take 2 years to make. Some people longer. Boyhood. And then in series of hours, a critic tears it apart, or comments on it. I think there is a question of what right we have to be critics, and sort of where that comes from. And actually, it's very hard to argue that everyone does have that right to criticise a work. I don't mean in a negative sense, in the critical sense. However, it's that thing about bringing the authority back to it, which is through informed knowledge of, the history of film, the knowledge of the directors, the actors, all those composite parts that build up why you can talk with validity about this subject, I guess. I still think to this day, despite the growing, presence of online, it's, print is dwindling. But I say there's probably still more weight given to print, that I think even from writers prefer to be in print than they do online, because I think there's a perceived cheapness to online, because you can just place it, the democratizing of it all means that anyone can set up a website, and how many are out there that start with Cine, and the thing is, that doesn't make it wrong. That makes it great that so many people are talking, and that the community is so much bigger. But there's definitely, perhaps from sort of the PR and marketing side of it, that print is seen to have more influence. But I don't know the sales of newspaper figures, but I can guarantee they've gone down over the years.
Yeah, so what's going to happen with this authority when print dies.
Exactly, yeah, and sort of. And
where will authority come from? Do you think in the future?
Well, there's an interesting thing growing as well, sort of more celebrity style criticism. So that you are a persona more than a celebrity, I suppose. So that you would work across TV, print, radio, and that your authority then comes by presence, and not necessarily from one publication. Perhaps you might, work for a national newspaper, then be on Sky, be on the BBC, be on the radio. It's, I suppose, perhaps your level of saturation, how many people read you, how many people hear you, and probably most importantly, how many people listen to you. Although actually, some of the most famous critics are not necessarily famous because they are liked. I think fame's probably the wrong word. Most well known.
For being known.
For known. Yeah.
No, I understand what you mean. What do you regard as the most important aspect of your critical work? And as a sub question to that, how important do you consider evaluation to be in what you do? For example, what do you think about star ratings, which is a subset of evaluation, but...
Star ratings are completely arbitrary, in my opinion. They are a useful tool. I don't actually know when they first appeared.
Funnily enough, I was told 2 weeks ago exactly when they first appeared, and I've now forgotten, but I will find out and I'll tell you later.
Yeah, I mean, they are a useful guide, and they are a nice sort of... It's a good way, sort of, if you buy a magazine and there's a section of it, it's a good way to sort of plan your reading, because I think most people will read the 5-star reviews, the 1-star reviews, and then if they have time, the 2s, 3s and 4s. It's sort of, I see it almost as like an index. But they serve very little purpose because they, what does 3 stars mean? How do you evaluate a foreign film that's at 3 stars and a Marvel film that's in 3 stars? Well, those probably don't equate, because you're certainly using different criteria on which to evaluate them. So essentially it's nonsensical, because a 3-star French film might be very good, but however the previous director, the director's previous film was much finer and much more subtle and much more eloquent. But so within their canon, there's so many variables that can affect a star rating system, that it's just sort of something that you go, this reads like a 3-star review. And it's like, what does that mean? It's not useful at all.
Given your belief that star ratings are not of great importance, and of not of great significance, let's say, have you ever had a star rating changed by an editor, and did it annoy you?
I actually haven't. Oh, no, I have. I do remember one case, and yes, I was very annoyed. I mean, there's the quite recently talked about discussion, and I think that the thing with star ratings is actually they've got more to do with marketing and PR than they do with criticism. They're a useful thing, maybe for posters, for ads, and it's that's fine. Sort of, you understand that if a poster is laced with multiple 5-star reviews and those awful one-pull quotes, excellent, marvellous. It's that does draw people into cinemas, and so I'm not against that, because anything that gets people watching films, I'm happy about.
It's just
but it's not part.
Yeah.
I don't see it as an important part of the critical world. But yeah, I was angry when it changed, but it didn't change for Machiavellian reasons of advertising. It just changed because me and the editor disagreed.
When you're required to apportion star ratings,
Mm-hmm.
Do you agonise over them?
Honestly, no. And I prefer the editor to choose the stars by reading my words. That's what's important to me, is the formulation of my argument of why something has worked or not worked. That's the important part for me.
on new, I suspect I know how you're going to answer this question, but on new media, so blogs and podcasts, and also aggregators like things like Twitter and social media, but also aggregators like Rotten Tomatoes or Metacritic. Do you regard all of these kind of new media as a boon or a bane to film criticism?
Boom. I do. I think one, things like IMDb, Rotten Tomatoes are incredibly useful resource, and also they're a great archiver that you can pull up old New Yorker reviews, and things like that. That's great, and it means people, because there's a danger, I think, especially in the way films are covered nowadays, that we don't give enough space to older films. We don't look back far enough, perhaps, or we're too obsessed with the current to think about retrospectives and re-releases and things like that. Whereas actually, that's just an important part of it. So, for instance, when Gone with the Wind got re-released, I think last year, it was really interesting to see how it shifted from its release to how people were reviewing it now. It's an interesting idea. But in terms of online, it doesn't. I see it as a boom in the sense that it does democratise, and that it gives everyone a chance to have their voice shared. That is good, as long as they, it's done with the level of responsibility and the sort of the desire to do it properly, I guess. But it does have knock-on effects, which are in saturated markets, wages go down. And so it can make it very hard for it to become anything other than a hobby for a lot of people. But, from a more objective academic standpoint, the more voices, the more debate, the more discussion, that can only be good for film.
Should the views of a professional or a paid critic be valued more than those of an amateur? And if so, why? Or why not?
Well, it's a double-edged sword, because whilst I believe... placing a value on it maybe not necessarily the most useful thing, in the sense of if it connects to an audience, if there are people who are reading it and enjoying it, that is a good thing. However, also the thing is, often people set up websites with the intent that it will lead to professional work, that it's a stepping stone on a journey to making it their full-time career. So to say they're of no less value, it's the social media term of reach, I suppose, is how far they reach is what will give them value. The trouble is, obviously media empires will always have greater reach, because budgets and historical things, how long magazines have been running, how long sites have been running, will have an impact on that. But no, I don't think you can say the professionalism is what makes one higher or lower, but I'm not sure I necessarily agree with the terms of hierarchies of how you view people. Of course, I think everyone has a right to share their opinion, but I suppose it depends on the intent of the writer. What do they want to achieve from writing reviews? Are they doing it because they personally enjoy it and they think a few other people will? That's perfectly valid. So I suppose it depends on how you look at it. Who's placing the value? Who's judging here? Are we judging because we do it for a living, or I imagine the main gripe will be if it means you earn less. That will be something that people will get concerned about, and rightly so, because everyone has bills to pay. So people will probably defend the validity of their opinions over those of others. But I don't see a harm in everyone existing, but how that works economically is a very big, difficult question.
Okay, can I change tack a little bit and ask you, this is going to seem a really strange question, but when you look at what you do as a critic, okay, when you look at film critical work, in what way do you, or does it, serve cinema? What good is film criticism doing for cinema? And I don't mean that as I don't mean that as an aggressive question.
No,
I think it does do a lot of good.
No, I think it's debate. It's the focal point and starting of debates. The endless amount of nights I will have had, either in my living room or outside a pub, chatting with friends, who will start conversations with, "Did you read this review?" And that will spark a conversation of like, "I can't believe how wrong they got it. Did they see the same film as me?" So the good it does is start debate. It keeps film alive, I guess, because it keeps it fresh, it keeps it constant, it keeps it energized. And the good it does is that how good films are made, or great films are made, is by footfall, people going to the cinemas. So if they read about it and they are inspired by your reaction to it, whereas, say, a Marvel film will put on 10 screenings because Disney is a huge studio and can afford to, it's more difficult for a smaller distributor to get their film out to critics and get it covered. But I think there's also a responsibility there to make sure you see that diverse range of films, that you're not a superhero critic, you're not just a French film critic either, that you give voice to the beautiful array of films that are out there, but making sure you encourage people to go see the ones that really will. It's an aggrandizing thing. I don't think films change your life per se, but I think they have the potential to change how you view the world, or how you view a subject, or make you think differently. That's what the job of a good critic is to tease out those good films and make sure people know about them. That's the good film criticism does. Then there are other issues of sort of this week there's 21 films out in cinemas.
Yeah, I think it's the most ever, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's, how do you cover that? How do you, as a publication, let alone as an individual, how do you watch them all, write about them all, and within that space actually talk about them sensibly? It's a crowded market, but it's about finding the good ones, and also warning people off the bad ones.
And one last thing, given that this is your platform and here you are,
Yeah.
If there's anything at all that you want to discuss that I haven't touched upon, because there are lots of...
Well, yeah, I think sort of there are areas, I think, of the blurring line between marketing, PR and journalism is a really fascinating one at the moment, and I think particularly with online, tends to be treated more as marketing than as journalism, which is very sad. So there's this sort of thing of the amount of times I get sent generic interviews and things like that, or it's like, well, no, I'd like to write something about this, and I'd like to take my take on it. That there needs to be sort of clearer boundaries, perhaps, between how this all operates, and that we don't exist to serve studios or distributors to praise their films, and we exist to talk about those films critically, sensibly. And I think there is an ethical thing to film criticism that often gets ignored because it gets trivialized, because it's an art, it's an entertainment. For instance, like sort of calling yourself a film journalist, people are often... My own father was shocked that I belonged to the NUJ. So it's like, oh, I don't really think of you as a journalist. And it's like, I'm not in Iraq, you're right, I'm not a news reporter. But I am a journalist. I exist to write for the general public to read. So shouldn't that be something that we care about more as part of our identity, not in our authority or things like that, but just remembering we are journalists and critics, that we serve general public and each other in our own community, because there is a big film community. I find it, at screenings, for instance, how everyone talks to each other, that it's a very vocal social community. You've just got to look on Twitter for how everyone backs and forths and things like that. So maybe there's a level of protectionism in my mind that we need to sort of stand fast to hold together what we care about, rather than just allowing it to be dominated by market economics.
It's funny though, when you talk about the kind of relationship between film journalism and marketing and distributors. I wonder if we begin compromising us the moment we accept the invitation to a press screening, compromising ourselves the moment we accept an invitation to a press screening.
It's interesting because I suppose that's to do with deadlines in a way. You know, would it be so wrong if we didn't have press screenings?
Those deadlines exist for marketing.
Exactly.
That's the only reason they're there.
So what would be the harm of, I think it was in like Paul and Carl's book, she talks about, no, it's Anthony Lane's, where he talks about, you know, he would get up on a Friday morning and go catch the first screenings and then go home and write over the weekend for publication the next week. And you think that, you know, I suppose it doesn't help people decide what to go see on a Friday night or a Saturday or Sunday afternoon or whatever, but it's perhaps a purer way of operating, you know, and in terms of financial cost, that just falls to whoever you write for to pay for your ticket. But it does free the reviewer from worrying about things like, say, oh, you know, I've had conversations with people before where they've been said, you know, oh, I'm banned from that studio's films because I gave them a bad review, and that does put us in pockets, I guess. But there's a sort of sense they've got their job to do, and I understand why those marketing mechanisms exist, but it's how we want to do our jobs, I guess. You know, there's also discussions about that with sort of for features, you know, with interviews, junket trails and things like that, that how it's seismically changed, that now a 10 to 15 minute slot is seen as a good thing. You know, video junkets can last for 6 minutes. Yeah. What do you expect to tease out of a director in 6 minutes, other than some flash-looking marketing material? Whereas, you know, you hear of profile interviews that went on for days. You know, they'd go spend a couple days out with the director, they'd go for lunch, they'd chat about things, and you'd get these, you know, it was proper new journalism, I guess, where you really got some insight, and the copy was different because they hadn't been media trained. It's a thing where you just think it would be nicer if it was purer, and it's difficult to say. I've only done this sort of 5 years, but how drastically it's changed someone who's been doing it for 30, 40 years, how they used to do their job. And also I can't imagine that, given the amount of releases that we've talked about, that how you would manage to cover everything, you know, without the current systems in place. But that's a market economics thing as well, because it's worrying that, yeah, we are compromised. How that will change, I don't know. Unless we all decided to stop going to screenings.
Which isn't going to happen.
No. And then again, it's also opportunities of festivals, for instance. You know, if you are a freelancer or you do it as a hobby, it's unlikely you're going to be hopping off to Cannes or Berlin or Tribeca or wherever, which is an opportunity where you can see the films without influence, really. Those are the first times. There's no marketing campaign. There's no... you do see them fresh off the bat, and it's quite interesting seeing, in the rare occasion that critics change their mind. I wonder if that comes, you know, were they being more truthful when they were watching it at a festival, and then influenced by how they saw the story because of how a studio positioned it, whether that changes their mind. That's a good point to raise, is that a lot of work is expected for free. I don't know any other industry where work is expected for free. It's a glib comparison, but, you know, if a plumber came round your house, you wouldn't pat them on the back and say thanks for the work, but I'm not paying you. And I mean, this is part of an online trend as well, user-generated content, which is a good thing, you know, in the sense of, yeah, of course, but that should be an addition to, you know, professional critics writing. But I don't know how you would ever, as a freelancer, depending on obviously what level and who you're being employed by and paid by, but it's a really difficult market. I mean, I freelanced for 2 years, and it was terrifying, utterly terrifying. You know, how I would ever, you know, rent somewhere bigger, or you know, have a family. You know, all those sort of things. Just sort of, it could potentially keep you in a stage of arrested development because of the wage you're on, and that's not right, in my opinion. That sort of, if you ask someone to write something, you should expect to pay it. But that's not just in our industry. You know, novelists are facing that as well with book deals. That it's the actual words themselves aren't seen. It's the valuable thing. It's what happens around them, and
plus we devalue ourselves because we're all willing to.
Oh
do
yeah,
it.
don't get me wrong. This isn't
Yeah.
the problem of the employers. It's actually, if people are willing to work for free, that hurts everyone.
Yeah.
Because we have no value. And I think also, you know, your levels of morale, if you're doing something for free, you know, I remember the first time I got paid for writing, I was like, oh, I can call myself a writer now. And it's actually, well, you could call yourself a writer before, you were still writing, but there is seeing something that, oh, my words have value now. I mean, that might be something more about capitalism than, but how we view it is that we do need to think about our actions. You know, if we do work for free, essentially I'm harming your wages, I'm harming my own wages, and the industry as a whole, because we're not helping each other. But then, you know, there's the other thing of when people do get paid, is it enough? You know, what is the price of words? People, I think, often get shocked at some, you know, what you would charge for a 1,000-word piece or something. It's like, well, how can it possibly be worth that? You know, but at the same time, you can hardly say a 1,000-word article that you've thought about, you've cared about, you've researched, you know, and someone gives you £20. It's
£20 for several days' work.
Yeah,
so yeah.
And it's well, it shouldn't be legal for starters, really, but it is, because we choose to do it. But that's partly to do with the passion I think people feel for what they do, and why they want to talk about it is because these things mean a lot to us, that we make an active choice to spend our evenings and our daytimes sitting in darkened rooms watching film after film after film, which sounds great to many people, but given by some of the quality of some of the films, it's not great. But it's a thing where we've got to think, we are passionate, we do love it, but if we want it to be our jobs and the way, you know, we want to live, then we have to treat it like a business, just like anyone else would.